Shalom, welcome to Shikul Da'at. I'm Rabbi Josh Rose. Why does the Torah make Moses so resistant to God's command? Why would the preeminent prophet respond to the realization of God's long ago articulated plan to Abraham with such obduracy? What are we to learn? In this week's Torah portion, Moshe continues to argue with God that he is not the person for the task of freeing the Israelites from Egypt. We can find within the lines of the text a meditation on ego and purpose. And depending on our perspective at the beginning of the Parshat, Moses is either a negative or positive example of the role of ego. So let's dive in. God instructs Moshe to convey to the Israelites the divine plan of redemption. The Torah then tells us, "Vayidaber Moshe ken el bnei Yisrael velo sham'u el Moshe mikotzer ruach u'me'avada kasha." Moses told this to the Israelites, but they would not listen to Moses on account of their crushed spirits and cruel bondage. Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. Hashem spoke to Moses, saying, "Bo Deber el Paro melech Mitzrayim v'yishalach el bnei Yisrael me'artzo." Go and tell Pharaoh, says God, king of Egypt, to let the Israelites depart from his land. And then, Vayidaber Moshe lifnei Hashem lemor en bnei Yisrael lo sham'u elai ve'ech yishme'eni Paro v'ani aras hafatayim. Moses spoke in Hashem's presence, saying, "The Israelites would not listen to me. How then should Pharaoh heed me, a man of uncircumcised lips?" So Moses doubts his ability to communicate effectively because of his own speech difficulties. And he said something similar last week in chapter 3 of Shemot. After resisting God's demand that he return to Egypt to rescue the Israelites, and employing various arguments to push back against God, so to speak, Moses says there, "Bi Adonai lo ish devarim anechi gam mitmol v'gam melshashom gam me'az debercha el avdecha ki kaved peh uchvad lashon anochi." Please God, I am not a man of words, neither in the past nor now, as you speak to your servant, for I am heavy-mouthed and heavy-tongued. Moses seems practically crushed by his own insecurity with 4 phrases in 2 verses, labeling himself as, first, not a man of words, second, heavy-mouthed, third, heavy-tongued, and then this week, a man of uncircumcised lips. We're not going to delve into the specific meaning of each of those phrases, but clearly there's some speech issue that Moshe has that he's using to argue against God sending him. And in addition to these concerns, neither Pharaoh nor the Israelites are moved by Moses' speech. So the first issue is Moses' own capacity to articulate, and the second is the response of these other parties. On this subject, Moses uses a bit of logic with God. Rashi points out this is one of 10 appearances of a logical argument known as kal v'chomer in Hebrew, or in English, a fortiori. If the lowly Israelites won't listen to me, then of course the mighty Pharaoh won't listen to me, Moses is saying. His profound doubt overcomes him once again. The anxieties to which he gave voice at the burning bush were brushed away by God's strategy of appeasement. Aaron, God said, would be Moses' messenger and would speak for him. But then toward the end of last week's parashah, a graver doubt surfaced in Moses. Remember that the Israelites were hostile to Moshe as a result of Pharaoh's cruel response to their uprising. They lash out, leading the prophet to turn and confront God. And Moses says there, the Torah says there, then Moses returned to Hashem and said, "Why, Hashem, did you bring harm upon this people? Why did you send me?" We know from reading the story and hearing about it how it comes out, and so we overlook something extraordinary that is given voice by Moses there. Total rejection of God's plan. He doesn't just accuse God of failing to ensure his success, but of causing harm to the very people that God claims to want to save. This radical doubt boils over again, so try to hear it with fresh ears. Again, he says in this week's Torah portion, the Israelites would not heed me. How then should Pharaoh heed me, a man of uncircumcised lips? Now, some have pointed out that the logic of Moses' argument fails here. The Torah tells us that the Israelites don't heed Moses because their spirits were crushed from brutal labor. A proper kal v'chomer argument would then argue that Pharaoh would also have to be crushed by hard labor, and even more so, and that's why he wouldn't hear them. But of course, that's why he wouldn't hear Moses. But of course, that doesn't describe Pharaoh at all. In fact, he lives a life of luxury. So according to Moses' logic, he should be in a good position to listen carefully. So if Moses isn't following logic here, what is he really saying? So look at this. Another way of phrasing Moses' claim is, the messenger is inadequate, the oppressed aren't interested, and the oppressor will never change. Moses is not simply expressing misgivings, but rather rejecting God's entire plan from A to Z, or from Aleph to Taf, so to speak. Aviva Zornberg points out, Moses, too, I'm quoting here, belongs to the complex party of those who block God's message of redemption. Though he presents Pharaoh and the Israelites as the obstacle to fulfillment of the divine vision, in fact, it is Moses himself who is the obstacle. God is, as it were, at the mercy, if we can say such a thing, of Moses. The point here is not to amplify doubts about Moshe, of course, but rather to highlight that in Moses' very humanity we see something profound about ourselves. So why does the Torah put Moses' intransigence and apparent deep-seated doubts at the very center of the story? What do we learn by Moses, in Zornberg's language, blocking God's message? To see what's at stake, I want to look at a beautiful Zohar on our Torah, a beautiful passage from the Zohar on our Torah portion. We have to remember that God's purpose here is not just to free the Israelites, but to make them know that God is God. In verse 7, God instructs Moses to convey to the Israelites these words, "V'lakachti echem li la'am v'hiti lachem Elokim v'yadatem ki ani Hashem Elokechem ha'motzi etchem mitachat tzivlot Mitzrayim." I will take you to be my people. And this is just before Moses protests that he's a man of uncircumcised lips, that God says this to him. I will take you to be my people. I will be your God. And you shall know that I, Hashem, am your God who freed you from the labors of the Egyptians. So what does this phrase mean? V'yadatem, you shall know. The Zohar understands this not as a prediction, but as a commandment. The Zohar says, Pekudada kadma'al lechol pekudin. This commandment precedes all other commandments. The very beginning of all commandments is to know the Holy One in a general way, to know that God rules over all, that God is the master of the world, and that God created all worlds, the heavens, the earth, and all their parts. This is the general. And the end of all is in the particular, to know God in the particular. And the Zohar continues, a human being comes into this world and is engaged in the general and the particular. A human being in this world is both the general and particular. The repair of this world is in the general and the particular. The Zohar tells us that the idea of God in general is what we might think of as philosophical, the notion that is hard to touch and feel, that there is something that we call God that is beyond us and over everything. We come to realize that in our puniness we have very little control over our world, and the religious assert that there is something else, that is God, overseeing all creation. Where we all get caught up, though, is the prat, the particular. Part of the reality that we label God is us. Each of us in our thoughts, our emotions, our bodies, and our actions form some part of the divine whole. God is the klal in the language of the Zohar, the whole. We inhabit the world of the prat, of the particular, our own limited experiences, thoughts, emotions, and sense of self. As it does with all of us, God's eternal vision comes up against the specificity and limitations of Moses' life in all of its specificity. Moses has good reasons, after all, for discounting the radical hope of God's plan. He is Egyptian royalty, very far from the Israelites. That's part of the specifics of his experience. He's also an Israelite, though, and therefore hated and suspected by Pharaoh. He is indeed limited of speech because of some circumstance of his upbringing that's addressed in the Midrashim of our tradition, which we haven't spoken about here. And we're talking about a frail and beleaguered people confronting a great ancient Middle Eastern power. It is precisely in what the Zohar labels as the prat, the specifics, that God's plan is halted in the life of Moses. Some object that we're not encountering Moses' failure to see the totality of God's power, and therefore a justification of hope. Rather, we're seeing Moses' fitness for prophecy, evidenced by his humility. So people read his objections to God in the opposite way. For example, the Ramban says that Moses' humility was so great that he genuinely saw himself as insufficient. And this is precisely the quality that Ramban and others say made him worthy of prophecy. Indeed, on the verse in which Moses refers to himself as inadequate in speech because he is of uncircumcised lips, there's an unusual phrasing. Moses spoke in the presence of God, lifnei Hashem, rather than to Hashem. The Netziv says that because it didn't say he spoke to God, but rather in the presence of God, that in fact Moses was really speaking to himself, and God, so to speak, overheard him. That is, Moses' doubts were not performative or argumentative, but rather the expression of genuine doubt about his fitness for the task. So that seems to point to evidence of Moses' true humility. But if we use the Zohar's meditation on the struggle to know God in general and in particular, we see that there is no practical difference between Moses' alleged humility or his potentially obdurate faithlessness. In both cases, God's klal, the larger reality of God in the world, is limited and cut off by the prat, by the ego. Now, spiritually speaking, ego doesn't mean pride or a high opinion of oneself. It means seeing the self as the arbiter or final stopping point. And the self, the prat, the specific, is always in tension with God's vision. God has a unified vision of the world in which God's goodness creates wholeness and peace and overcomes division. Our own egos stand in the way. This, then, is an answer to the question we opened with. Why does the Torah emphasize Moses' resistance? Why wasn't the greatest of all prophets immediately receptive to God's plan? Moses' greatness is that he responds like a human, struggling to make the general idea of God's unity a reality in his own life. And then, eventually, he overcomes ego and he transcends the self to make this possible and goes on to fulfill God's hope, as it were, God's mission, God's commandment that the Israelites be brought out of Egypt and that they know God. Our own egos stand in the way of God's desire, whether we are too cynical to hope, too self-centered to care, or too filled with self-doubt to act. All of those responses to the problems of this world have in common a center on self. The Torah highlights Moses' struggle with this all-too-human predicament so that we can learn from what comes next. Moses emerges as the great prophet, allowing ego to give way to God's harmonizing vision. Only then can he and all of us make our way out of Egypt. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great Shabbos.